The waterfall had been frozen since November. It had been frozen every November for as long as anyone in Coldfall, Montana could remember. The same way the mountain had always been there, and the same way the winters had always come hard off the Canadian border, and the same way the things that had always been true about this valley had always been true, which is completely and without any particular interest in being questioned. You grow up in a place like Coldfall, and the mountain becomes part of the furniture of your world. You stop seeing it the way you stop seeing the kitchen table. It is just there, it has always been there, and the idea that it might one day have something to say about the way you are living your life at its feet is the kind of idea that occurs to outsiders and not to people who have been here their whole lives. Nobody had ever gone behind the waterfall. Not until a retired Navy SEAL drove a dark blue pickup into town on a Tuesday in late October with a massive white German Shepherd riding shotgun and a trailer full of equipment that told the town, before he had introduced himself to a single person, that whatever he was here to do, he had thought about it carefully and had come prepared to do it seriously. The town noticed him the way small towns notice everything that doesn't fit their existing inventory of the familiar. Completely. Immediately. And with the particular quality of attention that is 2 parts curiosity, and 1 part the comfortable assumption that it already knows what it is looking at. It didn't. He bought the old Harrow property on the ridge above town. He went behind the frozen waterfall. He started building something in the cave back there, and the town formed its opinions about this the way the town formed opinions about everything, which is quickly and with considerable confidence and at considerable volume. Particularly from Roy Decker at the county road office, who drove up twice to tell the man he was wasting his time on a property that would kill him before spring. Only one person asked Ethan Rowe what he was actually building. A schoolteacher named Nadia stopped her car one morning on her way to school and walked up to him and said, "What is this going to be?" He said it was a shelter. She said, "For what?" He looked at the mountain above them for a moment and said, "For whatever comes." 3 months later at 4:47 in the morning the mountain answered that question. And the 41 people inside the cave behind the frozen waterfall, including Roy Decker, including the mayor, including a 7-year-old boy that the white German Shepherd found under 3 feet of snow 40 yards from the entrance in the dark, were alive because one man built something nobody asked him to build, for a day nobody believed was coming. Stay with me. Because what Frost did in that snow, and what Roy Decker said sitting in the corner of that cave, and what the town of Coldfall put on the sign at the waterfall when it was all over, that is a story you will carry with you. There is a particular kind of quiet that you only find in mountain towns in the deep middle of October, when the tourists who came for the fall color have gone home, and the ski season hasn't started yet, and the town exists for a few weeks in a kind of pure unperformed version of itself, going about its business without any awareness of being observed. The way a person moves through their own house in the early morning before anyone else is awake. Coldfall, Montana had that quiet in the 2nd week of October, and it was into that quiet that Ethan Rowe drove his dark blue pickup on a Tuesday afternoon, coming off the mountain highway and down into the valley with the specific unhurried pace of a man who is not in a hurry because he has already decided where he is going, and the going is simply the going, not a race and not a performance. He was 42 years old and looked it in the specific way that men who have spent their lives doing physical things in difficult places look their age, which is honestly and without apology. The weathering in his face, not the weathering of neglect but the weathering of use, the kind that maps real experience rather than simply time. His hair was ash brown and kept short in the practical way of someone who has never thought about hair as a thing that requires thought, and his eyes were a quiet steel blue that had the quality of eyes that process what they see without broadcasting the processing, taking things in with the focused efficiency of someone trained to read environments quickly and accurately, and to do this so completely that the reading has become invisible even to people watching closely. There was an old rope burn scar on his left wrist, a pale, slightly raised line that wrapped 3/4 of the way around. That was old enough to have become simply one of his features, the way certain things become features when they have been present long enough to be integrated rather than noticed. In the passenger seat, beside him rode Frost. Frost was a white German Shepherd of 91 pounds with a coat so densely white and so thick that he seemed to carry his own weather system with him, a traveling patch of winter in whatever season he happened to occupy. His eyes were the thing that stopped people, pale ice blue, an unusual color in any dog, and in a dog of his size and presence something that people found themselves thinking about after they had looked away, the specific blue of glacier ice in certain lights, almost colorless, almost white. and carrying in their paleness a quality of attention that was different from ordinary dog attention in the way that a precision instrument is different from an ordinary one. He had been trained as an Avalanche rescue dog in a military program and had been paired with Ethan during the last years of Ethan's service, and in the 4 years since they had been together through enough different situations in enough different places that the bond between them had long since passed the stage of development and had become simply the permanent shape of how both of them moved through the world, together, with the specific mutual understanding of two creatures who have been tested in real conditions and have found each other reliable. Frost had his nose at the cracked window, reading the October mountain air with the focused concentration of an animal conducting a professional assessment of a new environment, his pale ice-blue eyes moving between the road ahead and the mountain above the town in the specific systematic way of a working dog gathering baseline information about a place he is going to be responsible for. The town of Coldfall had a population of 612, a main street that was honest rather than charming, a diner that had been serving breakfast since before most of its current regulars were born, a hardware store run by a man named Pete Garland who had inherited it from his father, and who had the sociable efficient manner of a small-town merchant who genuinely likes people and has spent 30 years getting better at showing it. There was a county road office where Roy Decker had worked for 22 years and from which he had developed, through sheer accumulated tenure, the unofficial position of primary voice of local skepticism. Not because he was the smartest or the most experienced, but because he was the loudest, and because his particular brand of confident dismissal had never, in 22 years, been publicly wrong about anything significant enough for the wrongness to stick. There was an elementary school where Nadia Osei had been teaching 3rd grade for 4 years, having come to Coldfall from Minneapolis for reasons that were her own and had worked out in the specific way that moving to a mountain town for reasons that are your own tends to work out, which is that the town becomes yours before you have fully finished deciding whether you intended to stay. And there was a frozen waterfall on the north face of the ridge above town that had been part of the valley's geography since before anyone could remember, and that nobody had ever particularly thought about beyond the specific aesthetic appreciation that a frozen waterfall reliably produces in people who see one for the first time in winter. Ethan had found the Harrow property through a county land auction website at 11:30 on a Thursday night in September, sitting in a rental house in Billings with Frost asleep at his feet, and the specific variety of restlessness that had been visiting him since his discharge running under his skin in the way it did when he had been in one place long enough for the stillness to become uncomfortable. He had been out of the service for 14 months. He had done the transition programs and the counseling and all of it with the genuine effort he brought to everything, and what he had come out the other side of all of it understanding was that what he needed was not in any city and was not available through any program, and that the thing that had been trained into him over 16 years of service, the specific readiness that comes from living in environments where the difference between prepared and unprepared is the difference between surviving and not, was not something he could simply switch off because the official context for it had ended. He needed a place that required it. He needed a mountain. The Harrow property was listed as 48 acres on the north ridge above Coldfall, with an existing cabin in serviceable condition and a particular topographical feature that the listing described as a seasonal waterfall, frozen November through March, on the north face of the property, adjacent to a natural cave formation of undetermined depth that the previous owner had apparently never investigated. Minimum bid was $900. Ethan had looked at the topographic maps for 45 minutes, read the geological survey notes from 1987, studied the satellite images of the ridge and the valley below, and then looked at Frost, who had raised his head from the floor and regarded him with those pale ice-blue eyes in the way he had of looking at Ethan when something was being decided. Ethan had placed the bid that night. He had won the following morning. And 3 weeks later he was driving into Coldfall on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Pete Garland was the first person to speak to him without the guarded quality that most of the town's initial interactions carried. He came out of the hardware store as Ethan was loading supplies into the truck on his second day in town and said, "You must be the fellow who bought the Harrow place," and Ethan said that was right. And Pete said he had been up there once when he was a boy and that the cave behind the waterfall went back further than it looked from the outside, and that his father had told him the original Harrow who built the cabin in the 1890s had used the cave for cold storage and had shored up the entrance with timber that Pete suspected was probably still in there somewhere under the rock fall. Ethan had looked at him with those quiet steel blue eyes and said that was useful to know, and Pete had said he thought it might be, and they had stood there for a moment in the October cold with Frost sitting between them looking from one face to the other with those ice-blue eyes, and Pete had said that was quite a dog, and Ethan had said he was, and that had been the beginning of the only genuinely uncomplicated friendship Ethan developed in Coldfall. The work started on the third day. Ethan drove up the ridge road in the early morning and went behind the frozen waterfall, which in October was not yet fully frozen but was building its ice shell from the edges inward in the specific methodical way of things that are not hurrying toward a seasonal state but simply arriving at it, and he found what Pete had described and more. The cave entrance was partially blocked by a rockfall that had happened at some point in the past several decades, but behind the rockfall the space opened into a chamber approximately 40 feet deep and 25 feet wide, with a ceiling that ranged from 8 feet at the entrance to nearly 12 at the back, and walls of solid granite that had been doing what granite walls do since before any human being had ever seen them, which is hold. The old timber shoring from the 1890s was there, some of it still functional, some of it long since rotted into the shape of itself, and at the back of the chamber there was a secondary space, a narrower passage that Ethan explored with his flashlight on the first morning and found terminated in a second smaller room that was, if anything, more structurally sound than the first. Frost explored the entire system on that first morning with the methodical focused attention of a working dog conducting an initial assessment of an operational area, moving through the spaces in the pattern he used and returning to Ethan at intervals with the calm certainty of an animal that has found the space acceptable and is now ready for the work to begin. The work that Ethan did over the next 3 months was the kind of work that does not announce itself, that proceeds quietly and systematically, and without any of the visible drama that would make it comprehensible to people watching from the outside. He cleared the rock fall from the entrance first, moving the larger stones with a come-along and chains and the patient mechanical intelligence of a man who has moved heavy things in remote places without assistance and has learned that the leverage is always there if you take the time to find it. He reinforced the entrance with new timber, proper dimensional lumber that he had Pete order from the supplier in Billings, doing the work with the care of someone building for a specific load condition rather than for appearance. He installed a ventilation system, simple but effective, 2 pipes driven up through the rock to the surface above, capped with screens against debris, positioned to create a crossflow that would keep the air in the chamber breathable through an extended occupancy. He built sleeping platforms along the long walls, rough but functional, 3 tiers on each side, enough to sleep 30 people if needed. He laid in supplies on the shelving units he installed at the rear of the main chamber. Food, water in sealed containers, medical kit, blankets, emergency lighting, the things that a body needs to survive for days in an enclosed space when the world outside has become temporarily uninhabitable. He did this without talking about it. Not because he was secretive. If Pete asked him what he was doing on a given day he would tell him, and Pete listened with the interested attention of a man who has decided that this person is worth listening to even when the listening doesn't immediately produce something he recognizes. But Ethan did not volunteer information about the project to people who had not asked, because he had learned a long time ago that explaining preparations to people who have not yet understood the need for them is a kind of arguing against the preparation itself, and he was not interested in arguing about this. He was interested in finishing it. Roy Decker drove up the ridge road on a Thursday in November when the waterfall was 3/4 frozen and the cave entrance was framed in fresh timber and the supply shelves were half stocked, and he sat in his county truck for a moment looking at the work before he got out. And then he got out and walked over to where Ethan was working and said that the north ridge above the waterfall had a historically unstable snowpack and that whatever Ethan was building there was going to be buried under 30 feet of snow before February. Ethan had straightened up from the work and looked at Roy with those quiet steel blue eyes and said thank you for the information. Roy had said it was not information, it was a fact. Ethan had said he appreciated the distinction. Roy had driven back down the mountain with the expression of a man who has delivered a reasonable warning and been received with a courtesy so complete that it left him nothing to object to, which was more frustrating than being argued with. He came back in December with the same message and received the same courtesy and drove back down the mountain with the same frustration, which he deposited at the diner in the form of a declaration that the fellow behind the waterfall was going to get himself and his dog killed before spring, and that the county was going to have a search and rescue situation on its hands that could have been avoided if people with common sense had been listened to when they spoke, and the diner received this with the warm agreement of people who enjoy a consensus. Nadia Osei had stopped on the Ridge Road one morning in November on her way to school. She passed the bottom of the access road every morning, because Frost was at the edge of the road doing his morning snow assessment, and she had seen him from her car and had been unable to drive past a dog that looked like that doing something that looked like that without stopping to understand it. She had gotten out of her car in her practical winter coat with her school bag over her shoulder, and had walked up to where Frost was working the snow at the tree line, and had watched him for a moment, and then looked up the road at where Ethan was working at the cave entrance and had walked up to him. She had said, "What is this going to be?" Ethan had said it was a shelter. She had looked at the mountain above them, at the ridge and the snowpack building on it, at the waterfall and the cave and the work that was visibly serious work rather than casual work, and she had said, "For what?" And Ethan had looked at the mountain himself for a moment, and then looked at her and said, "For whatever comes." She had nodded. She had looked at Frost, who had returned from the tree line and was sitting between them reading the exchange with those pale ice-blue eyes, and she had said, "Is he an Avalanche dog?" Ethan had said yes. She had looked at the ridge again for a long moment with the observant eyes of a woman who pays attention to things other people have learned to overlook, and then she had said to Ethan that she lived on the south side of town with her son Tommy, and that Tommy was 7, and that she would very much like Ethan to tell her if he ever had a specific reason to think they should be somewhere other than their house. Ethan had looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has encountered unexpectedly direct thinking and is receiving it with honest respect. He had said he would tell her. She had said thank you, walked back to her car, and driven down to school. Ethan had watched her go and then looked at Frost, who was still sitting in the snow looking at the road where her car had been. He said, "She is a smart woman." Frost had turned those ice-blue eyes on him for a moment, and then gone back to his assessment of the ridge without comment, which was as close to agreement as Frost typically offered on any subject. The calls Ethan made at 2:17 in the morning on the 16th of January went in a specific order that he had already worked out in his mind weeks before he needed to make them. Nadia first, because she had a child and lived at the south edge of town and needed the most time to move. Then Pete Garland, because Pete would believe him, and because Pete knew every family on the north side of town by name and by address and could get to doors faster than Ethan could. Then Mayor Linda Hess, because whatever her opinion of Ethan had been over the past 3 months, she was the mayor, and the decision to move the town was hers to make, and he was giving her the information she needed to make it. He did not call Roy Decker. Not because he was excluding Roy, but because Roy's number was not one he had, and because the time it would take to find it was time he did not have, and because Pete would get to Roy as surely as he would get to everyone else on the north side. Nadia answered on the first ring, which told him she had not been sleeping deeply, which told him she had been thinking about the conversation in the school parking lot more than she had perhaps let on. He said it was time, and she said she understood, and she said she and Tommy would be at the cave in 40 minutes. He said 30 if she could manage it. She said she would try. Mayor Hess answered on the third ring with the voice of a woman who has trained herself over 20 years of elected office to be fully functional within 2 seconds of waking regardless of the hour or the circumstance. Ethan gave her the information in the precise compressed way he had been trained to give information that required immediate action. The snowpack reading, the barometric drop, the dog's behavior over the past week, the timeline he assessed as hours rather than days, and the location of the shelter. She asked him 2 questions. The first was how certain he was. He said certain enough to be calling her at 2 in the morning. The second was how many people the shelter could hold. He said 40 comfortably and 50 if needed. She said she would start calling. She started calling before she had finished the sentence. Pete Garland did not ask any questions at all. He said, "I will start at the north end and work south," and he hung up. And Ethan knew without any doubt that Pete was already putting on his coat before the phone left his ear, because Pete Garland was the kind of man who receives information and acts on it without the intermediate step of deciding whether the person who gave it to him was worth believing, having long since formed that opinion and put it away. Ethan dressed in the dark in the specific efficient way of someone who has done this before. Thermal layers, jacket, boots, gloves. And he took the large flashlight and the medical pack from the shelf, and he looked at Frost, who was already at the cave entrance with his pale ice-blue eyes on the frozen waterfall and the ridge above it, his broad white chest forward, his body carrying the specific coiled readiness of an avalanche rescue dog that has been waiting for this and is now fully Operational. Ethan put his hand on the dog's back for a moment, not to direct him, simply to make contact the way you make contact with something reliable when you are about to do something serious, and then he went down the ridge road toward town. The mountain was completely still when he left. That stillness was the thing he noticed most. Not the ordinary stillness of a winter night, but the specific held-breath stillness of something large that has finished its preparation and is at the last moment before release. He had felt it before, in other mountains, in other contexts, and he had learned that the stillness itself was information, that it was the environment completing some final internal arrangement, and that the appropriate response to it was to move faster than you think you need to move. He met the first group of residents on the lower ridge road, the Calloway family, 4 of them, the father carrying the youngest who was perhaps 3 years old and still mostly asleep, the mother with a bag over her shoulder, the older boy walking with the serious purposeful stride of a 10-year-old who has decided that whatever is happening is a thing he is going to be capable of handling. Pete had reached them. Ethan turned them back up the ridge road and told them the cave entrance was 300 yards past the point where the road curved, that there would be light at the entrance, and that they should go directly there without stopping. The father looked at Ethan with a specific expression of a man who has been awakened in the middle of the night and told to leave his house, and has had no more than 2 minutes to decide whether the person telling him this is worth listening to, and who has decided yes. He nodded once and turned and led his family up the ridge. The next 20 minutes were the kind of 20 minutes that compress in memory because the individual moments are moving too fast to be stored with the resolution they deserve. People on the road in various states of dress and preparation, some of them frightened and some of them still in the processing phase between sleeping and understanding what they had been told. Ethan moving between them with the calm directing voice of someone who has organized groups of people in conditions significantly more chaotic than this, and who understands that what people in uncertain situations need above everything else is a single clear voice telling them a single clear thing, which is where to go. He did not explain. He did not argue. He pointed up the ridge road and said the cave is 300 yards, there is shelter and supplies, go now. And they went, because the voice and the posture and the specific quality of a person who knows what they are doing in a situation that requires knowing what you are doing are things that human beings respond to at a level below conscious choice, the level where the body makes decisions faster than the mind can ratify them. Mayor Hess was on the road at the south end of the evacuation area coordinating with the same compressed efficient authority that had presumably gotten her elected and kept her elected, her silver-bobbed hair visible in the flashlight beams of the people moving past her, her sharp gray eyes tracking the flow of residents with the focused attention of someone running a count in her head. She caught Ethan's eye as he came past and said she had 37 moving and was still looking for 4. He said he would find them and went. He found 3 of the 4 at a house on the northwest end of the north side, an elderly couple and their adult daughter who had apparently slept through Pete's knock and through Mayor Hess's call and through the sound of their neighbors moving in the road outside, and who opened their door to Ethan with the slow blinking confusion of people being woken for the 3rd time in 30 minutes. He got them moving in 90 seconds, the daughter supporting the elderly woman on one side and Ethan on the other, the elderly man walking with the deliberate dignity of someone who has decided that whatever is happening he is going to handle it standing up. The 4th was Tommy. Nadia had been on the road with Tommy at her side for perhaps 15 minutes of the 20-minute evacuation window, moving up the ridge road toward the cave with the fast focused pace of a woman who had been thinking about this walk since the conversation in the parking lot and had therefore made every preparation for it that she could. When Tommy pulled away from her hand to look at something on the uphill side of the road, a sound, a shadow, something that 7-year-old boys find compelling at 3 in the morning regardless of the circumstances, and was gone from her side in the 3 seconds that it takes for the thing you are most afraid of losing to become the thing you have lost. She had called his name. She had searched the immediate area with her phone light. She had made the specific terrible calculation that a parent makes when they are faced with 2 impossible choices at once, which is whether to keep searching or to keep moving. And she had done what the calculation told her to do, which was keep moving toward the cave because the cave was where help was and where she could get more lights and more people to search, and she had done this while saying Tommy's name continuously into the dark and the cold. She arrived at the cave entrance 37 seconds before frost. Ethan was inside the cave settling the elderly couple when he heard Nadia's voice, and the quality of it told him everything before the words did. He came to the cave entrance and she was there, and she said Tommy, and then she said his name again and stopped because there were no other words in the language for what she was trying to say. And Ethan looked at her for 1 second and then looked at Frost, who was not at the cave entrance. He was 40 yards down the slope in the dark, in the snow beside a section of young pine at the uphill side of the road where the bank rose steeply, and he was digging. Ethan ran. He covered the 40 yards in the specific way that a man covers ground when a child is under snow, which is without any of the ordinary management of pace and footing that running in the dark on a snowy slope requires, accepting the cost of that in exchange for the speed. Frost was working at the snow beside the bank with the methodical controlled urgency of an avalanche rescue dog executing a recovery rather than a search. The distinction matters, because a recovery is what happens when you already know where the subject is and are removing the material between you and them, and Frost's movement had the quality of knowing rather than seeking. The precision of a dog that has already completed the assessment and is now in the extraction phase. Ethan dropped beside him and got both hands into the snow and started working. The snow was packed, not the loose powder of a fresh fall but the compressed accumulation of weeks that had been further settled by the weight of the bank above it, and it came away in chunks that required effort, and Frost worked beside him with the focused patient efficiency of a dog that is entirely certain of what it is doing, and is doing it at the maximum possible speed while maintaining the precision that the situation requires, which is the only way avalanche rescue dogs work because the alternative is injuring the person you are trying to reach. Ethan's hands found Tommy at 14 inches of depth. Not unconscious, his hands moved when Ethan's touched them, the small specific movement of a child's fingers closing around something in the dark, and Ethan said out loud, I have you, you are all right," in the low steady voice he used with Frost when Frost needed steadying. The voice that communicates to whatever is receiving it that the person speaking knows what they are doing, and that the situation is manageable, and that the correct response to the current moment is to trust the person speaking, which was true in all of those particulars. He had Tommy clear of the snow in 40 seconds, and in his arms in 45, and was moving up the slope toward the cave entrance in under a minute from the moment his hands found the boy. The avalanche hit at 4:47 in the morning. Ethan knew it was coming in the 3 seconds before it arrived because Frost, who had come back up the slope ahead of him, stopped at the cave entrance and turned and looked at the ridge, and his pale ice-blue eyes caught the flashlight from inside the cave and for a moment seemed almost to glow, and then the sound arrived. Not the gradual building sound of something coming from a distance but the immediate total sound of something that is already everywhere. The sound of a large snowpack releasing not at a single point but along a fracture line that runs for hundreds of meters across a ridge face. The specific enormous sound of a mountain rearranging itself in a way that has been building toward this moment for months and has now arrived at it all at once. Ethan was through the cave entrance with Tommy in his arms before the first wave of displaced air reached the waterfall, and Frost was beside him, and the timber-framed entrance did what he had built it to do, which was hold. The frozen waterfall held too. He had understood this possibility when he chose the location, that the frozen column of ice and the granite behind it would act as a deflector, splitting the primary flow of the avalanche around the cave rather than over it. The physics of it something he had worked through carefully in the planning phase and had concluded was reliable, and was now, in the 4 minutes and 30 seconds during which the mountain completed its rearrangement, being confirmed. The sound was absolute, the kind of sound that exists below hearing and above it simultaneously, felt in the sternum and in the teeth and in the specific inner ear frequency that the human body reserves for things that are genuinely large, and then it passed through its peak and began its diminishment, and then the specific settling sounds of enormous displaced snow finding its new position, and then a silence that was not the silence of before but the silence of after, which is a different thing entirely. Tommy was sitting against the cave wall with Nadia's arms around him, his small face pressed against her jacket, not crying, past crying, into the specific stillness that comes after the fear has done its full work and the body has decided that the person holding you is solid and that solid is enough.